In this video, my aim will be to solve a very simple but very important question. Why do people end their lives? What can push someone so far from itself up to a point where death seems more tempting than life? Where is that limit? When do we get to that point? With the alarming rise of suicide victims and the increasing worry for mental health issues, the last century is yet to confront one of its biggest doubts to this day. What is in our society? What has to do with our modern world? What is it doing so wrong that every year more and more people choose to end their own lives? Why is it that the suicide rate is skyscraping and is rising every year non-stop? Why do people choose to finish it all? Why this world is pushing us to the brink of despair, choosing to end our journey, to put an ending point to our lives? Well, Émile Durkheim, or Émile Durkheim in French, was a teacher considered to be the father of sociology, discipline which is in charge of studying the behavior of human groups and societies throughout history. And Émile Durkheim, in his book titled The Suicide, he offers a different approach to the issue, hoping to give an answer, a solution, through his study of the phenomenon as a death caused by society, as if suicide was origined in society, not in the mind of the victim. Is an analysis from the study of the behavior of society, not by the psychology of the suicide. So he will study the suicide in order to solve this question of why do people end their lives. He will study it from the point of view of society as the main factor that causes people to end their own lives. In this video, we will approach Durkheim's work in order to explain his deep analysis of the suicide as a problem that matters to sociology. And of course, we will try to find some answers to the questions of the beginning, treating the topic with the highest grade of respect I possibly can. I hope that this will serve as a potential answer for those who are struggling or searching for answers, and for all of those who know someone who is in this situation and want to understand what is the true issue or what is the origin of the problem. Well, I think that Durkheim's work can be a good perspective to start and to try to understand why do people feel that way and why do people kill themselves. This analysis will be made in the most objective and respectful way possible, as the main goal will be to raise awareness to the world that we have to care more about mental health and we have to talk about this more. Mental health problems are true illnesses, are real problems, and they are more and more frequent nowadays. So we have to put the focus in that, because nowadays suicide and depression and anxiety is in every part of the world and is one of the major causes of death. So we have to put the focus and we have to raise awareness in order to understand why do people end their own lives. First of all, to begin to understand the phenomenon of the suicide, Durkheim begins defining the suicide as every case of death, direct or indirect, positively or negatively caused by the own victim with the knowledge of the consequences of his action. So there is a knowledge the person who is trying to kill itself will die after doing so. It's different from the case, for example, of someone suffering from dementia who jumps from a window, because that person is mentally insane. It doesn't know that it's going to die, or it doesn't care if it's going to die or not. And this rules out any case of accident or attempted murder, because every case of death has to be done by the victim, and it has to be done positively, which means the victim can kill itself in the act, or it can be done negatively by stop eating, for example. So Durkheim gives a broad approach to the suicide. Now, to truly truly understand why the suicides exist and why in the mind of the person, of the individual, death can be more tempting than living, and to understand why people kill themselves, Durkheim begins explaining what is the relation between the individual and the society, because if society is the main factor, we have to understand first what is the relation, what are the roles that we take in this two-part vinculation. What Durkheim teaches is that if we take part in a certain country, for example, or in a certain job, or we are part of a certain family and a certain group of friends, therefore we are all taking part in a society and we are all having society imposed to ourselves, because society has a coactive role in our own lives, as every group that we take part upon imposes a series of paths and a series of regulations upon ourselves. For example, the educational system, or the family values in family, or religion if you come from a religious family, the culture, the traditions with your group of friends. All those things are sort of imposed to us since very young. So Durkheim says that it's a relation where society imposes to the individual. But also he says that society has two main roles within the individual. First of all, society has to regulate the individual, has a regulative role, as it gives the individual a sense of what he can do and what he cannot do in a society. But society also has an integrative role. It has to integrate the individual into something bigger than himself. It makes the person part of a broader group of people and gives him a sense of purpose related to that broad picture. So society is coactive, is regulative, and is integrative for Durkheim. Then why is suicide a matter of sociology? If this is the relation, where is the suicide in this equation? Well, Durkheim teaches that sociology, based on statistics, separates the suicide from any other correlated issues, for example, depression, mental illness, any particular case, to understand why suicides in general happen. He wants to understand the phenomenon of the suicide in the broad picture, but that doesn't mean that he does a faulty generalization. He just wants to find the cause, to find every possible solution in particular cases. So he begins from broader picture and then he takes it to the particular cases. So based on the statistics that sociology and Durkheim uses to understand the suicide and the suicide rates, some numbers today seem very alarming if we take a look. Over 49,000 people died of suicide in 2022, meaning that at least one person killed itself every 11 minutes. That's a lot. That making it the 7th biggest cause of death in the United States, which is one of the biggest countries in the world, so it's alarming. The global rate of suicide is more than double the rate for men than for women, which means that also the suicide is a phenomenon much more common in men, and we will have an explanation for that later. Also, there is an interesting fact, as most of us would believe normally that the countries with the highest rate of suicide are the poorest countries, or the ones that have the worst conditions for living. But the countries with the highest suicide rate are not the ones you'd usually expect, because Guyana in South America, or Russia in Europe, and South Korea in Asia, they aren't countries that seem to be poor. The suicide isn't related to bad conditions of living or poverty. And also, there are moments in histories, if we take a look at the graphics, where the suicide rate goes much higher than the usual relatively stable count. For example, the 2020 pandemic or the Wall Street crash in 1929 were cases, particular cases in which the suicide rate went much more high than usually. What these numbers show is that even though the suicide rate globally has decelerated in the 21st century, it is still one of the major causes of death in the world. And it also showcases that the suicide rate goes higher when society is in a moment of crisis, in a moment of change, when a major event changes the moral laws of society, as happened in World War II, as it happened in the pandemic. So what Durkheim explains as the major cause of suicide is that when there is a big change, a big shift in society, those big changes break the relation of regulation and integration between the individual and society. That relation breaks, so the individual isn't regulated nor integrated anymore. And if a person doesn't have a vinculation and a regulation of certain moral and cultural paths to follow, the person gets disoriented, and explains that this disorientation that follows after these big shifts in society are the main causes of suicide in all its different forms. The moral laws of society have changed and they are no use for us anymore. So we don't have regulation, we don't know what we can do, where to go, or which is our purpose. We are not part of anything. We don't know where to go. And when we are lost and when we are lonely, death seems very tempting. Then Durkheim explains that there are different types of suicide depending in which is the type of shift that it's done in society. For example, an egoist suicide is done when society doesn't fulfill the integrative role, because the person doesn't feel part of that broader group of people. The person is lonely and doesn't find a purpose and isn't vinculated with his society, so he doesn't find a reason to live and kills itself. The counterpart to it is the altruistic suicide, when there is an excess of integration, when society changes to a point where a person thinks that society is more valuable than his own individual beliefs. So the person loses sense of itself and sacrifices himself for a bigger cause, for that broader group of people. And that is the case, for example, in the army. Then he talks about the fatalistic suicide, which is a kind of suicide where the regulative role is too excessive. There is too much regulation and the individual doesn't feel free to do anything, so it gets trapped in a job it doesn't like, as there is too much regulation. For example, North Korea, you cannot decide, and that lack of freedom is what makes them kill themselves. And the one that Durkheim develops the most is the anomic suicide. So the anomia, or anomie as he says, is this state of disorientation and of lacking of regulation. You don't know what you can or cannot do. You don't know what is the role of society into your own life because you are not regulated anymore. You are disorientated. So this is the state of anomia. And he says that there are different types of anomia. For example, there is the economic anomia, when a big shift is done in the economic world. For example, when the Wall Street crash in 1929 happened, a lot of people lost all their money and got in debt, and that situation made the suicide rate go higher. Then he also explains the domestic anomia, which can be, for example, the widowhood anomia, when a loved being dies. He also talks about the divorce anomia, and he says that divorce is one of the main factors of suicide in those countries where divorce is legal and has become more and more common, where the suicide rates went higher and higher too, because that breakup, the feelings that come after, made people more disoriented. But the good thing is that Durkheim also proposes a series of solutions to this issue of the suicide. He proposes a moral revinculation between the individual and society through an stabilization of the moral terms. So society has to learn to be more flexible and to prepare for different catastrophic events, so when it happens, it can still fulfill his role of integrating the person into society, regulating him, teaching him what he can and what he cannot do through education, religion, values and morals. But also he says that the individual has to take a big role in order to prevent the suicide, because if the person has a deep personal sense of purpose, when society parameters shake or change, we can stand still and follow our deep convictions of what we can and what we believe we cannot do. We have to develop a deep sense of moral in order to survive and to not get disoriented when society takes a big hit. And Durkheim also adds that if you are integrated in many different societies at the same time, different friend groups or different jobs, different kind of people, when one of them crumbles or shakes, well, you still have the others as a support. That's why one of the main reasons that the suicide happens is loneliness. Loneliness is one of the main factors. The lack of that person in which we can trust is often one of the biggest hits to the psychology of the person and to the mind of the person who is looking for surviving. And that's why death becomes more tempting. It's important to note that Durkheim's work has almost a century of age, so it was made in a very different time. And people often criticize that his approach may seem cold or too statistically biased, like he's trying to explain a human problem, a psychological problem, through a scientific and sociological way of reasoning, as if it was something wrong. They criticize him because it doesn't delve into each personal mind to find the true, personal, particular detonator of the individual suicide. There is a lot we can take from understanding how the society we live in conditions everything around us without noticing. Durkheim explains that role of society. He says that if society crumbles and a lot of things change too suddenly, it will impact each and every person differently, yes, but it will make it much more likely for people who already have a tendency, whether it is stress, anxiety, depression, to fall into the darkness, to kill themselves. I believe that Durkheim's work serves as a warning to all of us, because it alarms that at any moment a brutal change in society may come and we have to be ready for it. The biggest advice to prevent suicide will be to establish our own deep morals. He says that to decide for us which path or which way we want to live, we have to know what we love and what we want to do. We have to know what our own values are and our own directions are. And it's not that easy, and it doesn't have to be a huge certainty, but we have to know, at least at a certain degree, because society will change and society will hit us. I believe that loneliness, isolation and moral disorientation are the main causes of people losing themselves and losing their own minds. And people have suffered from many different kinds of horrors of the real and of the modern world. We have to try to be surrounded by others, and we have to try to find a certainty of what we are, of who we want to be, and where we are going. The truth is that the suicide is a constant war, where your mind plays against you and tries to push you without you noticing. I can assure you that the people who suffer from depression or anxiety are the last who will show it or who will cry about it, because it slowly eats you from the inside until you find that you have no purpose. But I want to make clear that life is valuable, and that the war can be won, and that the pain will cease, and that the chaos will stop. There is a way out of the maze. There is a solution to the inner struggle, but it's not in death. Death is not the solution. It is in embracing the beautiful gift of being alive, because it is a privilege. We cannot lose hope. So Durkheim teachings can help us find those main reasons, those main causes, and try to tackle them and to find our own morals, our own groups of people, and to get out of the darkness. Take care of yourself, love yourself, and above all, fight for yourself, because you deserve it. You have to do it for you. If you need it, you can write to me. You are not alone. I can assure you that you are not. Even though this modern society full of screens is showing us how disconnected and how fake and virtual everything is, there is real people behind them, and there is real people trying to help you. So you are not alone. thanks anyways for sticking around, and I hope that this video helped to find some answers or to find some sort of explanation. Please enjoy life, and I will see you in a future video. I know that I will see you. So have a good day, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night. See ya.